And today I am delighted to be joined for the entire show by the award-winning historian, author and broadcaster Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, who specialises in British national identity, the Anglosphere and culture wars. He is co-editor of the critically acclaimed Burke's Peerage, World Orders of Knighthood and Merit, and author of the best-selling A London Peculiar, as well as a senior fellow at the New Culture Forum and a trustee of the Canadian Royal Heritage Trust. Rafe, so brilliant to have you today. But how chilling is this? How chilling is it that we now have the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, and Tony Blair, very powerful figures in the orbit of Slippery Starmer, now effectively calling for the censorship of the internet, potentially even shutting down social media?
Yeah, you're quite right. Well, great to be with you first and foremost, Dan, and congratulations on your superb new podcast. It's really shaking things up, so bravo. But yes,
thank you, Rafe.
I watched that clip of the Speaker Hoyle, and quite frankly, trying to hear him analyze as an expert social media is sort of like me trying to give you an explanation about hip hop or grime music. It was so bizarre. It is chilling stuff, especially when the speaker combines things like misinformation with incitement and intimidation and so forth. As you said earlier, this is all about suppressing anything that contradicts the established narrative. So, for example, during the riots and the protests that we saw, if you didn't have a Twitter account, you would be inclined to believe the curated news that was being provided to us through the mainstream media and through our political class, that this was something that was an online creation of people like Tommy Robinson and bad actors in Russia and China. Those of us with Twitter accounts could see the full picture. We could see the Muslim gangs rampaging through the streets. None of that was provided to the British public. Now, unfortunately, there are only 20 million Twitter or X accounts in this country. So still the majority of people here are getting their news from the mainstream media,
which is just an awful prospect.
Which supports the class. And it's so sinister. And of course, who decides what's misinformation? As you quite rightly said, of course, if in 2020 you supported the lab leak theory, as I did, and I'm sure you did.
Oh, I did.
You would be cancelled.
And I was censored for it. Just last year, the FBI came out and actually said that they actually believe that lab leak was correct. We now find out the CIA was actually trying to cover up this as well. Remember, what's misinformation today won't be misinformation tomorrow. At one point we thought that that the sun revolved around the earth. Galileo was silenced and cancelled for misinformation. This is so dangerous to the dissemination of legitimate information. And of course, if you're going to penalize the social media companies by, say, fining them 10% of their global income or whatever, they're going to err on the side of caution. And so genuine, important, critical, legitimate discussion will be suppressed. It's very chilling stuff. This has only happened in the first 2 months of this new Labour government. It's showing its authoritarian streak. We can only imagine what's down the line over the next 5 years. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, to me, it's more than an authoritarian streak, to be honest. I think it's full-on totalitarian now. But what makes me sick, Rafe, is when I look at these big players in the mainstream media, the Goblin, Matt Chorley, the sociopath, James O'Brien, and they are encouraging this. And I think you're journalists. How disgraceful. And I presume it's because they know they're in lockstep with the establishment. They know the mainstream media is dying a slow, painful death, and this might slow it down a little bit.
Yeah, well, you've nailed one of the key points here, which is essentially that the legacy media, the mainstream media, understand full well that everything is moving online, that the new platforms of the future are obviously the online platforms. So it's in their own financial interest to do whatever they can to stem that ebb and flow away from them. But equally important is the fact that they are just as complicit in the new ideology that has now been implanted in Britain and across the West. I keep trying to explain to people that Britain is now a post-revolutionary society. The revolution's already happened. You don't have to fly red flags from the rooftops of our institutions and have, people mobs in the streets to have a revolution. The buildings around us look the same, but the people who inhabit those institutions are cuckoos in the nest. And so from James O'Brien to Keir Starmer and everyone in between, they all buy in to the new ideology. And for the first time in history, this has been a top-down revolution, a revolution of woke ideology and progressivism and authoritarianism and a clampdown on free speech imposed from the top to the bottom, as opposed to all other revolutions, which have been the grassroots up. Yeah. That's why you and I are having this discussion on YouTube rather than on the mainstream media, because we are the counter-revolutionaries.
Yeah, totally. And I absolutely love you putting it that way, actually. But I also really noticed that there has never been more of a gap between the establishment, and I include the mainstream media and I include mainstream politicians in that, and the majority. I call them the silenced majority. We are angry, Rafe. Now, how long can censorship keep a lid on that anger?
Well, of course, we've seen what happens when that anger does burst over. We've just seen that now. And of course, what is most telling is that when we had the riots in 2011 in Tottenham and everywhere after the shooting of Mark Duggan, a black man, by the police, when we had the riots and protests in 2020 with BLM, what did we hear from both Conservative and Labour alike? We had Starmer and Rayner saying, well, we understand the causes of this. We understand the motivations, and we sympathise with you about the death of George Floyd, this American criminal who put a gun to a pregnant woman's belly. We understand why you're upset about all of this stuff. On this occasion, there was none of that. The media class, the political class, everybody coalesced around this attempt to slander everybody who was concerned about the level in which their towns and cities had fundamentally changed. They were all smeared and slurred and slandered as far right. That's why they're trying to cut down on free speech, because they realize that the people themselves can see what's going on. But if the people don't have any access to these platforms, if they're not able to actually see anything but the curated editorial news that they're fed, then hopefully they can suppress that. Because the only way that multiculturalism and immigration can survive in this country, for example, is by draconian clampdowns on free speech and a suppression of the sort of video that you just displayed.
Rafe, would you go as far to say that multiculturalism is tearing the country apart?
Yeah, look, barely a day or a week goes past when you don't have a police commissioner or a mayor or a politician saying that diversity is our greatest strength. I'm afraid far from being our greatest strength, when you combine it with mass immigration and multiculturalism, and you have the super diversity we have today, it is our greatest weakness. Britain is fast becoming not a united kingdom, it's becoming a united nations. We are dissolving into a series of ethno-nationalist silos. And unfortunately, that is proving itself extremely damaging, of course, irreparably damaging to any sense of cohesive universal identity. Social cohesion breaks down. It's not just me saying this. Left-wing socialists, not sociologists and academia, have done a meta-analysis of all the 87 studies on the issue of social trust and social cohesion, and they find that increased diversity on local neighborhoods leads to a reduction in trust, leads to a deterioration of local neighborhoods. People vote less, people stay at home more, they don't go out as much into public. You see public buildings and so forth deteriorating because people no longer feel that they can trust each other, not just between different races, also even within and between the same members of the same race. There is no evidence at all that diversity is a strength, but no one has been brave enough to see that. And the rot in the Tory party is so deep that you even had the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, minting a 50 pence coin saying diversity built Britain. This is the new myth that you see being created, that immigration and diversity built Britain, which of course is a great slur on those generations of people from the British Isles who actually did build this country over centuries.
But breaking right now, Rafe, there is a massive shift going on in terms of the tectonic plates in British politics. proven by an election yesterday that you won't hear much about in the mainstream media, but the results are absolutely fascinating. Let's look at this post on X from Zia Youssef, who is the chairman of Reform UK, who writes, Reform has all the momentum in British politics and is bearing down on Labour. Crewe West has been a Labour stronghold. Yesterday's by-election result, big swing from Labour to Reform. So even though Labour has a very high vote here, 43%, look at this, Rafe, down 19%. Reform, brand new entry, 26%. The Tories at 17%. And then you go down to the more minor parties well below. So I'm sorry, Rafe, I believe Reform UK is now the second party in British politics. Am I wrong?
Don't apologize for it. I mean, this is a fundamental moment, actually, in British politics for a potential realignment. You know, we had the realignment actually in 2019 when small c patriotic Labour voters lent their votes to the Tories in 2019 with Boris Johnson. Unfortunately, we then had COVID and all of the money that could have been used for levelling up was spent on furlough and lockdown. And so reluctantly, those voters then turned to Labour at the last election. But they are fair weather friends of Labour. They're not really allied to Labour at all. And Reform, you can clearly see now, is seizing on that opportunity. And it's only been 2 months, as I've said, into the Labour government, where I think you have buyer's remorse with so many people who cast their votes for Labour when they naively didn't realise that what we're seeing now is actually the true colour of Labour. You know, Starmer said one thing to become leader of the Labour Party and betrayed the Labour Party members. He said another thing to become Prime Minister and he's betrayed Labour voters, people for the winter fuel allowance and so forth. But now the imperative is on the Reform Party not to drop the ball. The key thing.
So what do they need to do? What do they need to do?
They need to professionalize and they need to understand that they are no longer an outsider campaigning party. They are now within the walls of Parliament. And they need to be, in my sense, a bit more like the SNP. They need one single key cause to follow. SNP, that's independence. For the Reform Party, it must be immigration, 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 to paraphrase Tony Blair. I've said for a few years, actually, if there was an immigration party alone with that title, it would have done hugely well at the election. That needs to be the Reform's core thing to campaign on. But then, of course, having proper policies across the board. And it needs to have a dedicated policy unit, which I don't think it currently has very well so far. It may be wrong on that, but I don't think it has. And it needs to actually present itself as being a legitimate opposition and a contender to eventually become the ruling government of this country.
Well, do you know what I find fascinating, Rafe? I genuinely think that the Labour Party and the mainstream media have realised now that Reform UK could be in government in 2029. I've predicted even before the last election that we will have Prime Minister Farage in 2029. Some people might say I'm crazy, but let's see. But look at the attacks that are now coming. So this was in the Times this week. They have described Reform UK as a danger. They have described Reform UK policies as loopy. But the thing that I actually found most disgusting was this quote from a serving Labour MP, we don't know who, because of course they're completely gutless, describing Reform UK members as, quote, keyboard warriors, and saying many of these are in their Transformers pyjamas in their mum's basement, but what we haven't seen yet is Reform on the doorstep or speaking to voters. Now, obviously that's grossly offensive, but isn't it also a massive miscalculation, Rafe? Because this is always what the political elites do when they're trying to demonise a certain sector of society. They did it with Brexit voters. Well, they lost. They lost as a result.
Yeah, and you could mention Hillary Clinton's deplorables, right?
Yes.
Or the swivel-eyed loons that David Cameron referred to UKIP members as well. You're precisely right. It's that same condescension. It's the idea that we are the elite and the educated class and we understand things better than you do. And that patronizing tone no longer works. But what's, I think, actually also equally fascinating is that there is so much of this bile projected towards Reform and their 5 MPs. Meanwhile, we have 4 pro-Palestinian MPs who were elected on a one-issue mandate, and that was Palestine. No concern about education or healthcare.
Yeah.
And now
Corbyn, and don't forget Jeremy Corbyn leading the pack.
forming a 5 MP bloc now with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, we don't know. You think Reform could be Prime Minister, could be the government in 5 years? You may well be right. They could sink or swim in the next 5 years. What we do know is that Islamic sectarian politics is here to stay, and those 4 or 5 seats are only going to get larger. That should be striking fear into the hearts of any traditional liberal, let alone conservative. If you believe in women's rights and gay rights and everything else, you should be generally worried
it terrifies
about.
me. It terrifies me. And then you've got Labour saying, oh, we're going to make Islamophobia illegal. I mean, it's nuts.
Well, of course, what we're seeing here are attempts, because, of course, the Labour realizes the threat that the Islamic sectarianism poses to its own electoral chances, because they always depended on the Muslim vote. And so when you see them having these arms embargoes against Israel, and when you see this proposed Islamophobic legislation, which is so chilling, these are all ways in which they're trying to win back that lost Islamic vote. And, you know, and this follows just after we've had the government strike down the Higher Education Free Speech Act. You know, this Islamophobia legislation, which will come in either a standalone legislation or in a new Race Equalities Act, is going to be so chilling, because it's going to use what we call the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia, which essentially will mean that if anyone perceives something that you say to be an attack on Muslimness, whatever that means, you'll be guilty. So if you condemn child marriages, if you condemn first cousin marriages, if you can condemn polygamy, even if you start attacking the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, you could potentially fall foul of this. And even Sikhs are upset now in the Times yesterday, because, of course, the Sikhs endured the most terrible torture at the hands of Muslims historically. And if you make reference to that, they're now fearful that they could also become criminalized for that. This is the face of the Labour Party in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's totally terrifying, actually. The other thing that you're seeing at the moment, Rafe, is complete two-tier mainstream media coverage of Nigel Farage. This is constant. So I wanted to show you Richard Keys, remember him, the disgraced sports broadcaster. Yesterday he posted on X this picture of Nigel Farage lunching at Scott's in Mayfair. He said in the most expensive street in the UK. To be fair, I'm certain he was working on constituency business, although it didn't sound like it. Contrasted very nicely in this post by Dr. David Jeffrey, who wrote, Angela Rayner clubbing equals everyone needs a holiday. Nigel Farage having lunch equals how come he's not talking about Clacton 24/7? Or, and this actually, I know it can be viewed as a light-hearted issue, Rafe, but it infuriates me because the bias permeates the mainstream media now when it comes to every story. So we've seen over the past 24 hours the complete sympathy from Kay Burley on Sly News, from ITV News, from all of the mainstream media about the fact that Angela Rayner was criticised for going and making a fool of herself. There she is, by dancing like a drunken teenager in a club in Ibiza. And they think that's great. And actually, if you criticize her, then you're clearly against a working class hero and you're clearly sexist. But when Nigel Farage had the cheek to go to the RNC over a weekend, by the way, to visit his mate Donald Trump just after the assassination attempt, do you remember he was literally hounded? I mean, you had Channel 4 News and Emily Maitlis chasing him through the convention centre. So there is a two-tier media.
There's a two-tier media, and it's done with a great deal of venom and hatred, which you don't really see. And because there's hypocrisy on both sides of the political spectrum, but the venom with which you see it coming from one direction, almost literally, becoming swivel-eyed with the way in which they do it. I mean, Richard Keys, who posted this tweet, this is a man who is giving a moral lecture, and he left his wife to get married to his daughter's best friend, who is half his age. He lives in Qatar, right? The world's leader probably in human rights abuses, at least for the Indian workers and so forth who live there. A terrible place to live if you were actually a moral person, you would have thought. I don't know how much he's earning in Qatar. I mean, the hypocrisy of this is sort of champagne socialism at its very worst. But of course, this sort of hypocrisy, it goes far beyond just the personalities we're talking about, I mean, you remember, the left will forgive people on the left for doing the same things people on the right do in politics. So Obama deported twice the number of people that Trump did in any given year, including in those cages. Blind eye turned to all of that. Obama did 10 times more airstrikes than George W. Bush. For some reason, the left media never spoke about any of that. Now, of course, we've got places like Germany talking about the Rwanda plan, and I'm sure the media will skirt over that issue as soon as they can. Germany, of course, led by a social democratic chancellor who's on the left of the
what
party.
about, and also what about the hypocrisy, Rafe, when it comes to the fact that today Labour has admitted they are considering this plan of using Estonian prisons to house criminals from the UK. Now, in theory, I don't actually have a problem with that, but how is it any different to deporting illegals to Rwanda?
It's not at all. I mean, for heaven's sake, what people have to remember is that in 2004, Tony Blair and the New Labour back then were having discussions about deporting asylum seekers to Tanzania. That's conveniently forgotten about, and plans went very far down that sort of road. The hypocrisy here stinks, and that's what really strikes at the heart of British decency. I mean, the British people hate hypocrisy more than anything else, from your personal life to your politics. If you're a hypocrite, you deserve to be slung out of office. And the more that people see of this, I mean, the more, and that's one of the reasons, of course, you had all the issues about the COVID parties, and number 10 is the hypocrisy, it's double standards and all the rest of it. And the more people see this from Labour, the sooner they'll be turfed out of office.
And it is only Reform UK providing opposition now on any front. I know the Conservative Party is going through a leadership election, but they have literally departed the field. And this is in all areas. And I was really grateful to see Zia Youssef, again, the Reform UK chairman, taking on this complete lunatic and weirdo, actually, Ed Miliband, writing, British people's energy bills are unaffordable and keep going up. This is the state of our Secretary of State for Energy. This Labour government is heading for the rocks. And he posted this video of Ed Miliband, which if you haven't seen it, I mean, cringe away.
So my friend is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. So here I am on the latest stage of my GB Energy Tour.
And his answers, Rafe, are going to bankrupt us in the wind.
You're quite right. You would have thought that the man responsible for the Edstone, the man photographed, eating that ham sandwich so ghastly,
failing to,
would have learned his lesson about PR operations and so forth. I mean, look, every single expert knows that this idea to try to get net zero by 2030 is simply unachievable. Even the greatest supporters of it say, it can't be done before at least 2035. And yet, and we've now been told, of course, unofficially, that this will potentially, this vainglorious attempt to achieve the unattainable will cost potentially, hundreds of billions of pounds. And, where is the Conservative Party in all of this? You're quite right to praise the chairman of the Reform Party. The people in this country have not had a genuine Conservative government since 1997. Instead, they've had almost 30 years of a uniparty, a centrist uniparty, a leftist uniparty, New Labour versus, New Labour Light. And the Reform Party would not exist if the Conservative Party had actually been, conservative. How about that? They are conservative in name only. I've said for a long time they should be renamed the Neoliberal Party because they don't have a truly conservative, high Tory sort of bone in their body. And anyone anyone in the media who thinks that reform is beyond the pale and extreme, they simply either weren't alive in the 80s and 90s or they've got a very short memory, because the policies that reform takes on things, from immigration to culture, is simply the traditional conservatism.
Well, of course, Thatcher would be described as far right now, wouldn't she, Rafe? That is the reality. Thatcher would be viewed probably as too conservative for the Conservative Party. So Farage, right? You know him personally. You know what he's like. What does he need to do to become Prime Minister, and does he have it in him?
I think Nigel Farage certainly has the ability to be a prime minister, and a very effective prime minister, particularly under first past the post, if he can dominate. Because you have to remember, since the Second World War, not a single government has been elected with more than 50% of the of votes cast. So you only need about a third of the votes cast to do it. So it's not impossible. He needs to essentially, I would say, with greatest respect to him, trust other people to also carry the burden of reform on their shoulders too. And that means, not being worried about having potentially other bright sparks and bright lights alongside him. And I think if he assembles a really powerful team of people who are also charismatic and eloquent, then I think there is a very clear path to the people, because the public are calling out for change. They're calling for an end to this the uniparty, and reform, and other small parties emerging, and these are like weeds trying to break through the cement that has held down politics in this country for too long. The British people have been betrayed by the Tory party. They're being betrayed by the Labour Party, and they need change. And so the imperative is on reform to meet those needs. It's their duty to their country.
Breaking right now, there is a growing war on the right over the legacy of Winston Churchill, Britain's greatest Prime Minister ever, the man who changed us post-war, or a warmonger. This conversation has gone up a level after Tucker Carlson's interview with, again, someone called Daryl Cooper, who on one hand is described as one of the most important historians in the world today, on the other, a Holocaust apologist. Watch this.
I'm American. I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to, they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
So today I want to decode those claims with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, who is a historian and also a major supporter of Winston Churchill, in part because he wrote recently that in World War II, his relatives were murdered by both the Nazis and communists. His father is Sikh, his mother is Polish. His family came to Britain in the 1940s as part of the Polish government in exile. So, Rafe, it used to be the hard left that questioned Winston Churchill's legacy, but now it is folk on the right, including people who I have great respect for, like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. You're very angry about this, aren't you?
I am, and I think it's historical illiteracy of the greatest kind, and that's to put it mildly. Either people are being deliberately dim or disingenuous. I wrote my master's thesis on Winston Churchill. I served on the board of the International Churchill Society. I was honored to join Mo Molim for the final of BBC's Great Britain's on Team Churchill in 2020. I've been studying the man for 30 years, and no respected Churchill historian, no one who actually knows the subject, would support any of this nonsense. And I was amused to hear you refer to this chap Daryl Cooper as a renowned world historian. As far as I can see, the man never studied history in his life. He doesn't have a degree in history. He's clearly not trained in any historical skills that any academic would regard as being legitimate to actually come out with such outlandish statements. It seems that his knowledge is simply cursory, based upon reading other people's books rather than doing what any decent historian does, and that's to go to the primary sources, to go to the Churchill archives and so forth. And anybody who has even the most slight knowledge of Churchill in the Second World War can clearly see that this man wasn't responsible for the Second World War. For heaven's sake, he spent years in the wilderness warning the world about the threat from Nazism and so forth. But there are very few occasions in history, this is perhaps the only occasion in history, where the future of the Western world and the future of the free world rested upon one man's shoulder. You know, there's that old expression, cometh the hour, cometh the man. I don't think it was ever more relevant. And the reason I say that is because for 1 year, Britain, along with its empire, but Britain in terms of the continent of Europe, stood alone against Nazism, from the fall of France and Dunkirk in May, June 1940, right through to Operation Barbarossa when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. And for that year, resources were so slender that Britain was on the verge of defeat. And it was only Winston Churchill's iron will, resolute determination and spirit, and his masterful skill of oratory that kept Britain in the war. And if Britain had succumbed, if there had been another prime minister, which is one of the issues that this chap Darryl Cooper says, if someone like Lord Halifax, or Lord Holyfox as he's known, had become prime minister and sued for peace, there's no guarantee that Hitler would have recognized that peace treaty. You know, Hitler tore up every treaty he signed, and there's this bizarre idea by some on the sort of on the deranged right, like this man, that Hitler would have somehow, above all other treaties, this one he would have adhered to. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, let's have a look at that argument, actually, Rafe, because I want to show you what Darryl Cooper specifically said about this to Tucker Carlson, and then you can respond.
And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, you know, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, you know, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, well, if they hadn't, put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. You know, we don't.
So, Rafe, is it true that Hitler was looking for peace after the start of the war and he was spurned by Churchill?
Von Ribbentrop, who was Hitler's ambassador over here, certainly had approached that idea with the government. But of course, it wasn't a concerted effort. It wasn't an ongoing move by Hitler to try to get peace done. And this is where actually platforms like X and Twitter is very useful, because this chap, Darryl Cooper, has written a whole thread making all of these arguments. And Elon Musk's wonderful thing called community notes is where you can actually challenge legitimate misinformation. That's why you don't need to have a clampdown on X, because community notes provides that important function of allowing people to make up their own mind about what is misinformation or not. For example, Darryl Cooper says that Hitler sent Rudolf Hess to Britain to negotiate in parley for some sort of terms. Complete nonsense. Rudolf Hess came here on his own initiative, and it was without any sanction from Hitler. I mean, this is sort of second-rate sort of history. And let's understand what he's saying here. If Hitler had defeated Britain, or if he had got a peace treaty with Britain, Hitler would have attained complete domination of the continent of Europe. And he would have been able to actually focus 100% of his force against Russia, as opposed to the 70% that actually was spent against Russia in the Second World War. And after the war, Joseph Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev both said that if Germany had given them 100% of their force, if it was a simple one-on-one war, single front war, then Germany would have won. And if Germany had won, that means that Hitler would have controlled Europe and Russia and Africa and Asia with Japan. And of course, once it restored its forces, it would inevitably have come to attack Britain, because Hitler had always got Napoleon in his mind, and Napoleon was never able to conquer all of Europe, was never able to conquer Britain. And for Hitler's legacy to be greater than Napoleon, greater than Julius Caesar, there is no doubt in my mind that the man who always tore up treaties would tear up this treaty. Because another important thing to remember, Hitler didn't love or like Britain. He admired Britain. He admired Britain. He admired the way that we got our empire. but he wasn't a romantic and didn't have any idea of, the Anglo-Saxons being somehow our brothers and we must join together. This was a man who wanted to dominate and conquer. And if he had conquered Europe and Britain and Africa and Asia, he would then have been able to turn his attention on North America. That's why Franklin Roosevelt said in his Arsenals of Democracy speak, if Great Britain goes down, the peoples of America will be living at the point of a gun. And actually, it was British scientists who helped the American Manhattan Project for a nuclear weapon. If Hitler had actually taken control of Britain, it's very much likely that actually Germany could have used British scientists to get them towards the nuclear stage too. And all the time that we're talking about, having peace with Hitler, the peoples of Europe, not just the Jews, but the Slavs and the peoples of France and Denmark and the Netherlands and so forth, would all have been subjugated under the Nazi jackboot, as Hitler had free rein to also embark on his murderous policy against the Slavs and the Jews as well. To be so morally bankrupt as to think that peace with Hitler was an obvious way to go, I think is just reprehensible.
There are three other key areas where Churchill is specifically criticised, and it would be great if you could decode them or debunk them depending on how you feel. And I think the key areas, Rafe, are Churchill and the Bengal famine, Churchill and poison gas, and Churchill sending in tanks to crush the general strike. So do you think it is fair for him to be criticised in those areas?
Absolutely not. I mean, the Churchill and the Bengal famine, this only came up actually in the last couple of decades. There was a historian there was a woman called Mukherjee, I won't call her a historian, who has been completely deconstructed and her arguments destroyed by the leading Indian expert on famines. And this argument was never actually made in the 1950s or 60s. It's a very recent thing. There was a cyclone essentially in Bengal, which destroyed grain supplies and grain stocks. Now, normally what would happen on those occasions is you would have grain imported in from nearby areas in Asia. Unfortunately, of course, the Second World War was going on and there were no routes and supplies because the Japanese were blockading the routes by which normally you would import grain. At the same time, the local administrators in Bengal proved essentially incompetent and useless in how they were distributing what few reserves there were, and they hadn't been storing stocks very well. And thirdly, and importantly, Indian tradesmen were stockpiling grain to try to increase the price of all of this. Now, all of this is happening at the height of the Second World War. We have to remember that. Churchill did all that he could to try to alleviate this. That included, at a time when Britain had serious food shortages and rationing, Churchill managed to get 1 million tons of grain to go to Bengal, getting the Australians to help in that and appealing to Canada and America. Churchill wanted to get more shipping to do that, but the Americans said they couldn't because they were planning D-Day and they needed those ships to actually take part in the D-Day landings and so forth. So there is absolutely no evidence. And again, this is all about substandard pseudo-historians who don't do primary research, coming up with these crackpot ideas, whether it be Darryl Cooper or here with the Bengal famine. The reality is, if you look at the documentary source, it's quite clear. And even the Indian leading experts know that this was not Churchill's fault. And then, of course, what else did you say? Oh, yes, poison gas. Another one we quite often hear, Churchill sanctioned the use of poison gas against the Kurds and so forth. Again, go to Churchill Archives College and what you'll see is he's referring to tear gas. And tear gas, of course, is what is used by most police forces even around the world to control mob unrest and so forth. And then, of course, with the great other one is that Churchill rolled out tanks, for example, into Glasgow to crush strikers there. Well, the reality is that there were no troops involved in violence against the rioters who were rioting in 1819. We had in Glasgow workers there were calling for reduced hours and so forth. There was violence between the police and the strikers. The Glasgow authorities called for backup with troops. Troops were supplied, but they didn't engage in the violence. And there were tanks that were in sheds, and the tanks never even came out of the sheds. Churchill was only Minister of War Munitions. He wasn't part of the main decision making process. It was a Lloyd George government. He simply acceded to some demands to have troops there, but he said, let's not blow this out of proportion. It's all there in the original records, and no tanks went in. Again, this all came about in 1973 with another substandard historian wrote a book. No one had ever talked about this before 1973. Suddenly, long after everyone is dead, we get this now very popular idea in Scotland that Churchill, quote, rolled the tanks in the Battle of George Square. Complete nonsense. And I'm afraid this is what you see time and again. There are many legitimate areas to criticize Churchill. Churchill and the abdication crisis, Churchill and India, Churchill and the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War, Churchill as Chancellor of the Exchequer tying Britain to the gold standard. There are many ways in which you can criticize him. He was a flawed man, as well as being the greatest prime minister we've had. But all we need to have is serious academics and historians discussing this, rather than these amateurs that we are currently seeing, unfortunately, rise to prominence on social media, which again is great. That's what free speech is all about.
Yeah, because we can have the discussion, we can have the debate. Well, look, thank you so much for decoding that. I am a big Churchill fan. I always will be. Nothing is going to change my mind on that. It doesn't mean that there aren't grey areas. Of course there are. I do completely agree with Tucker that history is not a case of black and white, but I don't think that being contrarian and trying to turn Churchill into the biggest villain of World War II helps anyone. Now look, stand by, Rafe, because big news on the royal front. This has been a topsy-turvy week. We now learn that Prince William is demanding that Harry and Meghan apologise to him and Catherine. So we'll discuss that in just 1 minute.